Just as an aside, now that you've mentioned the PCR test, we've seen recently that the inventor of the PCR test, who's now deceased, had said it should never be used for testing for infectious diseases. Are you aware that he said that? And what is your position on the PCR test as an accurate guide, since it seems to find such small pieces of genetic material, and as opposed to an antibody test? What are the distinctions there?
I think that all tests have advantages and disadvantages. PCR was a major breakthrough for medical science. It did allow us to be able to detect different things, including infectious pathogens, if they were present, if their genome was present in very, very small amounts. As you realize, that also creates a situation where you may be able to detect something that does not have clinical significance. It's very, very good at detecting things, but then you have to ask, so does it really matter for what I'm seeing in terms of the clinical course? In many cases, the picture is very clear-cut. You have a clear syndrome of respiratory failure on someone who had no problem, and this thing has happened acutely, and then you get a positive PCR, and you don't see a positive test for other viruses or for other causes. I think that this is a very clear picture. But in many others, it becomes far more fragile as a diagnosis. I think PCR is a great tool, provided that we know what it means and how it is interpreted. Another drawback is that what we detect is fragments of virus, not necessarily infective virus. So it doesn't mean that someone who has a positive PCR is also infectious at the same time. That's something that may not be the case. Antibodies is a different story. And antibodies have been developed as a technique for even longer time compared to PCR. We have had the ability to measure antibodies for many, many decades now, and they give us an answer to a different question. They give us an answer to the question, do you have some evidence that you have mounted an immune response to the virus or to whatever else you might have been infected? Problems with antibodies include the fact that they need to be very carefully validated. So you need to have some very good sense of how sensitive they are, meaning how many people who have been infected they are able to detect antibodies in, and how specific they are, meaning is it possible that someone may have a false positive test and you believe that they have antibodies, but actually they do not. And there are many reasons why that may happen. If the antibody test is not very carefully designed, it may pick some cross-reactivity with some other viruses, for example, some old coronaviruses that were circulating in the past. This is why both PCR and even more antibody tests need to be very carefully validated. We need to check them against samples that we know for sure that correspond to people who have been infected, and we need to test them also very carefully against samples that we know for sure that they do not have SARS-CoV-2. For example, there are samples that were collected 2 or 3 years ago, and therefore SARS-CoV-2 would not have been around at that time. This is pretty much what we did in our study. We very carefully validated the antibody test that we used, and I think that other antibody tests are also being validated pretty thoroughly. You need to take into account their performance, what we call their sensitivity and specificity, in generating reliable estimates about what the results mean.